Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Today we're going to continue on in Unit 4 discussing political organizations of space, and today we're actually going to dive into a little bit of the actual organizations of space that are done politically, and we're going to deal specifically with the United States. An important thing to remember is that every country is I guess you would say at its own liberty to divide up its country and decide on its form of representation, how that's going to work kind of on its own. And so each country by that nature is going to be unique. So today we're going to discuss specifically the United States, especially since in the world that we're living in today, most countries have some form of representation. There's some form of voting going on because since World War II, that's really where we believe I guess the greatest good in terms of politics is in terms of that respect. So again, today we're going to be dealing with electoral geography, and specifically we're going to be dealing with American electoral geography. So in electoral geography in general, basically what we're looking at is just the internal political boundaries within a particular country. So we've been talking about countries as states, and so that's made it a little bit difficult in terms of thinking about the United States. The United States is broken down into 50 different states, and so I'm going to kind of reverse course a little bit and talk about it in those terms. So the United States obviously is broken down into 50 different states, and within each of those states there's also each state is broken down again. In Georgia, and I'll talk specifically about Georgia because that's where I live and that's where I teach, and so it's where I'm mostly familiar with. The state of Georgia is then broken down into counties, and each county is broken down into various cities. And so within each of those levels, from the state to the counties to the city, you have varying levels of representation and various levels of voting and things like that going on. You have voting for your city council, for your county commissioners, for the mayor of the city. You have it for the state. In Georgia, we have a state senate and a state house, so your state senators and your state representatives. Then, of course, you have your governor. And again, each state is really going to be made up differently, and they're going to do their politics and their elections a little bit differently. So we're going to focus primarily on the national level of representation. But again, each country you look at is going to have varying levels of political boundaries, and they're going to divide it up on their own. For the most part, the idea is that you want to try and create even representation across not necessarily territory and land, but across population. So you want similar numbers of population being represented so that you get a fairly even, I guess maybe fair is a word we might use, fair representation at the national level. And again, not every country is going to do it like the United States. Some people do it in terms of proportional voting and things like that, and each person's vote actually represents a vote for or against something, and not necessarily kind of this collective lumping together that we do kind of in the United States. But anyway, so we're dealing with representation in the United States. It's representation at the national level, and in the United States, for the most part, people are dealing with representation either through the Electoral College or through their congressional districts, and we'll deal with that here in just a second. But it's important to remember that when you're voting for president, you're not actually voting for the president, you're actually voting for an elector who you would like to suggest would then go and cast the ballot for that presidential candidate. I will remind you, if you're familiar with American electoral history and things like that, but initially when the government was created, the people only had one direct representative at the national level, and that was your representative that was in the House. The state governments, the state legislatures voted on the senator, the people voted on the House members, and then the Electoral College would then vote on the president. Today we have two direct forms of representation, which I don't necessarily think is productive, but this isn't that's neither here nor there. Now we directly vote for the senator and the representative, and then of course the Electoral College still chooses the president. And I'm not here to kind of debate the merits or the drawbacks of the Electoral College. We'll just talk about a little bit what it is. So we're represented, I guess you could say, through the Electoral College, and then we're represented at the national level through our various congressional districts, and we'll deal with that more in just a second. So just as I was speaking on just a second ago, when we talk about Americans in our representation, we are represented in two houses, at the federal or the national level. we are represented by the Senate, which is considered to be the upper house. And typically within each government across the world, you have what's considered to be an upper house and a lower house, one that's supposed to be, I don't know, kind of considered more mature, thinking in terms of the long term. You're supposed to have more seasoned individuals that, I don't know, the idea is that they're almost class, which is why those individuals cannot be moved into the Senate, or cannot run for the Senate until they are at least 35 years of age. You'll notice that elections are held every 6 years, and that goes back to the idea of thinking more in the long term. They're not necessarily supposed to be concerned with just the short-term consequences of their actions. And then also, this is an interesting point to make, is that they actually represent the entire state. And again, this is why I'm not necessarily a fan of having people elect the senators, but again, that's not really part of our discussion today. But they represent the entire state. So you have 2 senators that represent the entire state. Then you have the House of Representatives, which is considered the lower house. You'll notice that the age is different. You only have to be 25 in order to run for the House. And elections are held every 2 years. The House is supposed to be more of the short-term, short-thinking. You're supposed to be able to kind of, as things are happening, to express your opinions or your displeasure or pleasure with the House more frequently, and so they have to be more considerate of things that are going on, and they have much more, let's say, a shorter timetable in terms of the consequences of their actions. And you'll notice that they represent different parts of the state, and so I have the congressional districts of the state of Georgia pulled up, and you can see that within the state of Georgia we have 13 congressional districts. And you'll notice that some are smaller than others, and typically when we move into areas with larger cities, they tend to get smaller because there's higher populations, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. So just a little bit more about each in terms of the House and the Senate. In the Senate, again, you have 2 per state, so that means that we have a total of 100 senators that are going to be a part of the national government. And again, every state gets 2 senators. This gets back to the idea that the founders had, that they wanted kind of these dueling sets of representation. They wanted equal representation for all states, so that the smaller states in terms of population would be satisfied, but then you needed proportional representation so that the states with the larger populations would be well represented and satisfied. Now this kind of gets back to the whole idea of the type of government that was set up, and the whole idea is you want a rule of the majority that does not squash the rights of the minority. And again, that's more for your government, maybe your U.S. history class. But it's a really interesting and a really, an interesting and I think well-functioning form of government, regardless of the current things that are going on. But anyway, in the House of Representatives, there's at least 1 representative per state, and that's going to be based on the population of that particular state. So with that, some of the smaller states in terms of population only have 1 representative because they don't have very large numbers in terms of total population. In the House of Representatives, there are 435 members, and with that number, and this is one of the arguments that people are making about our current government and the way it's set up, is that number of members of the House cannot be increased without a constitutional amendment. So it's stuck at 435 members, regardless of how the population of the United States is changing. Now, as population increases, it's possible they might raise the number. We'll see what happens with that in the future. Again, the representation is going to shift in the states based on the population. So that's one of the interesting things about this idea that the numbers cannot be increased. So as we see some states are declining in population, like New York, like California, people are moving out of those states. Their representation in terms of not only House members, and we'll talk about the Electoral College in just a second, is going to begin to decline. And then what they try and do is you try to have congressional districts that are roughly about 710,000 people. So you'll see our state map again. Each of these congressional districts is supposed to represent around 710,000 people, and so that's why you have some smaller districts near large urban areas versus larger districts that are, and in Georgia, the southern parts of the state tend to be more rural than the northern parts of the state. And these are based on the U.S. Census numbers, so there's the potential for these things to change and for representation to shift within the states to change based on the census numbers. So I'll put a plug in here down the bottom about telling your parents to complete the census. That would be a great, especially if you want your state to have greater representation, if you want a larger voice in the national scene in the national government, that would be a good thing to do. Which leads us into a brief discussion on the Electoral College. So the Electoral College is important because it's the Electoral College that elects our president, and the votes in the Electoral College, or the number of votes that each state gets in the Electoral College, is going to be based on the representation that that state has. So it's a combination of the number of senators and the number of representatives that are within each state. Again, so every 10 years when that census comes around, if your state gains a representative, then that means your state also gains an electoral vote, which means that it also gains more prestige when it comes to the presidential elections and things along those lines. And they get more, I guess each state kind of gets more exposure. The presidents, the candidates are much more likely to kind of pander to that state. And so that's why it's important that these census are filled out, and they're filled out completely and correctly and all those types of things. Okay, and so again, the larger the state, the larger the population, the more votes the state's going to get, and typically the more important those states are going to be during presidential elections. Now, within the whole concept of electoral geography and the development of congressional districts and I guess the Electoral College as well, this maybe doesn't have as much to do with the Electoral College, but it definitely has a lot to do with voting for the House of Representatives, and the makeup of the House of Representatives is a concept called gerrymandering. And gerrymandering has been around for a really long time. It's one of the ways that state legislatures kind of mess with who is going to be at the national level. And so gerrymandering is simply a term that's used to describe the development and the creation of unfair congressional districts. Now, the reason they're unfair is because what they do is they provide an obvious advantage for one party or the other, whether it be the Republicans or the Democrats. And it's done in two different types of ways. You have what's called packing and cracking. Now, CPG Gray has some great videos on the Electoral College and gerrymandering and things like that. In fact, I would highly recommend you go look at those if you want a more in-depth and detailed discussion on gerrymandering, but we're not going to do that here today. I'm just going to kind of do an overview of it. And so packing and cracking, the ways that packing and cracking are different is with packing, what it is the majority party actually packs all of the minority party individuals into one or very few districts, so that the minority party is almost guaranteed the victories in those particular districts, but leaves the other districts for the majority party. And so you might say, well, why in the world would they do that? Well, instead of having several hotly contested districts where it's potential that the majority party can lose, what they do is they pretty much just give up one. They give up one or maybe one or two districts so that they can get the other districts really without much of a fight, not having to spend a whole lot of election money and things like that. Almost think of it in baseball as doing an intentional walk. You walk somebody maybe who's a dangerous hitter to get to the pitcher, or maybe someone who's not as great of a hitter. Then what cracking is almost exactly what it sounds like, is where you take the minority party and you crack them among, or you split them up among several different congressional districts, so that their voting power in each district is going to be lessened. And in that particular instance, what you're trying to do is almost lessen the potential that they could win any districts, or keep the potential that they could win districts much lower. And so one of the interesting things about gerrymandering is that congressional districts are actually created by the state Congress, and this happens every 10 years. The state gets to relook at its congressional districts and gets to decide whether or not they are going to redraw the district lines. And so with that, the majority party in the state Congress